Dr. Gundry is one of the world's top cardiothoracic surgeons and a pioneer in nutrition, as well as the medical director at the International Heart and Lung Institute Center for Restorative Medicine. He has spent the last 2 decades studying the microbiome and now helps patients use diet and nutrition as a key form of treatment. He is the author of many New York Times bestselling books, including The Plant Paradox, The Plant Paradox Cookbook, The Longevity Paradox, The Energy Paradox, and now, this March, he released Unlocking the Keto Code, which offers a new take on the keto diet that debunks common myths and shows readers how to reap the rewards of keto with less restriction. I love this book, mostly because it's really about mitochondrial uncoupling and a science I think you all would be really interested in. He's also the founder of Gundry MD, a line of wellness products and supplements, and is the host of the Dr. Gundry podcast. Tune in and let me know what you think. I really enjoyed our conversation and all the ways we can add to our plate and add to our lifestyle to nourish our bodies from the inside out.
Dr. Gundry, I have been looking forward to this interview for so long. You've had a number of best-selling books, but Unlocking the Keto Code was just such a good read. Really, I think a new look at the ketogenic diet. Some promises were made in there that we don't have to be in ketosis 24/7. And I love the science you share on uncoupling. So I want to dive into all of that on the podcast today, but I just want to thank you for your time and for being here. I know you have a busy practice and we got to get this information out there.
Well, thanks for having me, Kelly. Appreciate it. And yeah, the more we can get this information out, the less miserable people will be trying to do a ketogenic diet the wrong way.
Right. Well, let's jump into that. Like, what are some of the wrong ways we're doing a ketogenic diet, and what did we think was happening when we were in a quote unquote keto diet?
Well, so, the ketogenic diet is not new. It's coming up to 100 years old. And in 1930, it was designed at the Mayo Clinic to treat childhood seizure disorders. And the odd thing about that was that back in those days, there were no drugs and childhood seizures were devastating. Right. And one of the things that was noticed about these kids is that they would, after their seizures, they'd be in what's called a post-ictal state, where they really weren't responsive for very much. And if you had lots of seizures, these kids really didn't wake up very much. And so they didn't eat very much. And it was noted that the more these kids kind of didn't eat and were starving, the less seizures they had. And some smart people at Harvard and at the Mayo Clinic said, when you're not eating, one of the things that happens is you produce these compounds called ketones. And maybe it's the ketones that are quieting the brain down. And there's other ways to get ketone production rather than starving, because obviously it's not rather ethical to starve children. So they said the other way is you drastically limit carbohydrates. And so the original ketogenic diet was an 80% fat diet, 10% carbohydrates, and 10% protein. And it worked remarkably well. Actually, to this day, it still works remarkably well. But after a number of years, when drugs came along, it was pretty much abandoned. But drugs, one of the reasons it was abandoned, as you as a young parent know, and I as a grandparent and former, and I guess still a parent, it's nearly impossible to get kids, for that matter adults, to avoid carbohydrates to the extent that you really need to produce ketones. And so in the 1990s, it turns out that seizure drugs worked pretty good, but they had some bad side effects. And people got the idea, well, wait a minute, there's another way to produce ketones, and that is medium chain triglycerides, which hopefully most people have heard of MCT oil now. You can swallow MCT oil, and MCTs are unique in that they go directly to the liver through the bloodstream, do not pass go. And in the liver, they generate ketones regardless of what you eat. And so there started to be some literature in the 90s saying, hey, guess what? We could put kids on an MCT oil-based diet, and they could have a whole lot more carbohydrates, and they could have a whole lot more protein, and they'd be happy little campers. And it was demonstrated you still got the anti-seizure effect. And when I started my career in nutrition in the mid-1990s, that piqued my interest a lot. And you'll notice in my Plant Paradox book, and subsequently every one, the MCT oil was a standard part of my ketogenic intensive care program. And people, if they look carefully, they'll notice that my ketogenic diet is loaded with carbohydrates. Now, they're important carbohydrates, and we'll get into that. And people go, well, how the heck can this work? Because you're not making us, eat a pound of bacon and cheese sauce three times a day. And so it was really this ability to generate ketones from MCT oil that piqued my interest. The other thing I think we have to realize is that, and I'm guilty of this as anybody, we really thought, and I taught, that ketones actually make you an efficient fat burner. And because you're an efficient fat burner, that somehow makes you miraculously lose weight because you're efficiently burning fat. Now, you got to think about that for a minute. And the gas crisis makes us think about fuel efficiency.
Yeah.
And if there's a gas crisis, we would certainly want a fuel efficient vehicle. Now, that means getting the most miles per gallon out of a gallon of gas. That's fuel efficiency. And so, as I talk about in the book, I would want a Toyota Prius or something like that. If I really wanted to waste fuel, I would want a Ferrari, just as an example. Now, there might be other reasons I'd want a Ferrari, but for the purpose of the analogy, if I want to waste fuel, Ferrari is a good way to do it.
Right.
So let's think about that. If I'm becoming an efficient fat burner by being on a ketogenic diet, then I actually ought to gain weight, because fat has 9 calories per gram versus 4 calories per gram of carbohydrates or proteins. And so, wow, wait a minute, I'm going to become much more fat efficient at burning, and I'm going to eat twice the amount of calories as I was before. And yet you're telling me I'm going to lose weight? That doesn't make sense if these things are making me fuel efficient, an efficient fat burner. So if that's not the case, then, and in my last book, The Energy Paradox, I like to back up everything I say either with my own research with my patients or somebody else's research. And when I really started looking at the literature that came out primarily out of Harvard and the NIH, where I used to be a fellow, the literature says, no, that's exactly the opposite of what happens. You actually, ketones are a horrible fuel. They don't make you an efficient fat burner. They do just the opposite. And I got, well, what do they do then? And that's when I went down into the stupid rabbit hole that that ketones are signaling molecules. And signaling molecules, simplistically, are information that tells a cell or a subcellular organelle like a mitochondria to do something. And it turns out that ketones and lots of other things that we talk about in the book signal mitochondria to waste energy. And you go, well, now, wait a minute. Come on, Dr. Gundry. Waste energy? Ketones are generated when you're starving to death, like those poor little kids. If you're starving to death, the last thing you'd want to do is waste energy. You got to get every last little ounce of fuel. And so there was a very important paper that was written in the year 2000, and I recommend everybody read it. It's short, by Martin Brand. And it's really easy to remember. It's called Uncoupling to Survive. And so uncoupling, I hate the word. I spent 6 months trying to figure out a better word for uncoupling. And I don't really have one, but, and it's in the literature. We've known about mitochondrial uncoupling, believe it or not, since the 1930s. And we'll get back to that in a minute. So anyhow, Brant, we've known that mitochondria during ketosis become less fuel efficient. They literally waste calories. They do that because making energy, making ATP is incredibly hard work, and it's incredibly damaging to mitochondria. So the little engines that we need to make energy, if we're starving to death, if we lose our mitochondria, that's it. You're dead. So if you're really in a crisis where there's not much food, you have to do everything you can to protect mitochondrial function. And one of the ways that was discovered is, okay, we're going to tell mitochondria to protect themselves by not working so hard to produce energy. And we're literally going to tell each individual mitochondria to not work hard, don't damage yourself, do that by literally wasting some of the calories. Now you go, that still doesn't make sense. Brand said, well, yes, it does, because without mitochondria, you're done. And who cares about your muscles if you're starving to death? Who cares about your hair if you're starving to death? All we care about is mitochondria. Do everything in your power to protect yourself. And that's the theory. Now, you obviously have to produce energy. And the second piece of the equation, which is so cool, is that mitochondria are told to make more of themselves when this is happening. And I should have used the example in the book. Actually, I did, but my editor cut it. I still like it. Let's suppose we have a dog sled, and we have one dog pulling our dog sled. Well, the dog can pull the dog sled. You're not going to go very fast, and you're not going to go very far before the dog gets tired. Let's suppose we add 5 more dogs and have a 6-dog sled. Well, now each dog only has to do 1/6 of the work that the one dog had to do. You'll go a lot farther. You'll go a lot faster. The only consequence of that is you got to feed 6 dogs instead of 1 dog. And when you think about that, you say, wow, what a cool idea. Let's hitch some more dogs to the dog sled. Let's make more mitochondria. Each mitochondria doesn't have to do as much work. It's better off. You'll make the same amount of energy, potentially more than you did with just one, but you're going to take more calories to do it. And the odds are you're probably going to lose some weight. And so when you look at that, you go, wow, that is actually a pretty cool design. Now, it's really cool because mitochondria, as you know, and most of my listeners now know, are more than likely engulfed bacteria from 2 billion years ago. And they carry their own DNA, and they can divide separately from when the cell divides. So if you signal them to divide, mitogenesis, then they can do that without the cell dividing. And so if we need 6 mitochondria instead of 1, it's actually a fairly easy thing to do. So what's really cool about Bram is he says, hey, guess what? You don't believe me, I know, because this is so crazy. But he went on to publish a series of papers that look at super old individuals or super old, long-lived organisms. And lo and behold, humans, super old, have the most uncoupled mitochondria compared to everybody else. And you go, oh, man, this is pretty doggone cool. So that's how I got into signaling molecules as, if you will, longevity aids. And then you start going, well, are there other signaling molecules that do the same thing?
Right.
And I'll take a break, and
I want to summarize this for people because that was so much amazing information. So what we used to think was that ketones, we're burning ketones as a source of fuel, we're going to lose all this weight. And what you've uncovered, thanks to Brand's work, is that they're actually a signaling molecule. They're a signaling molecule for the mitochondria, those energy powerhouses that produce ATP, to literally split inside of a cell. You don't have to have a full cellular split, but you can have mitogenesis, where your mitochondria, that one dog, is turning into 6 energy powerhouses, organelles inside of your cell to make you more efficient, more energetic, and burn fat in the meantime.
Yeah. And the other amazing thing, most of us remember from high school biology, a cell, and we'd see the mitochondria that looked kind of like this little radiator. And, we said, oh yeah, there's a couple of mitochondria. So, well, there are actually thousands of mitochondria per cell, particularly in our heart, in our brain, in our neurons. I mean, thousands of them per cell. And just fun aside fact, brown fat, and a lot of people now know that brown fat is actually heat generating and energy wasting. Brown fat is brown because it's so stuffed with mitochondria that when you look at it at the microscope, it's just all mitochondria.
Wow, so fascinating and really exciting, because what I love about the science of nutrition and the science of our cellular biology is things like this, where you go, this doesn't have to be scary or fear mongering. We can go what can I do to uncouple these cells? How can I throw a few more dogs on my dog sled to have longevity and real true health? Yeah. And especially, it's interesting too, just seeing the mitochondrial, the research coming out about how to induce maybe mitophagy, or what's really, all of our mitochondria are quote unquote broken and they're not doing a good job. You're giving people the keys to really create more mitochondria in their cells to be more efficient. So this uncoupling, this is such cool science. And I want everyone on the podcast to understand some of the things that you talk about in Unlocking the Keto Code, because it is a tricky way to get people to learn about mitogenesis and uncoupling and really get to the nitty gritty of what they need to be doing to create and start this process in their own bodies. So other than ketones, what else can we be doing to create this, to start uncoupling?
Well, let's go back to World War I. And it was noted in World War I, factory workers in France and Germany, where they were making munitions, bombs, artillery shells, that these factory workers, munition workers, were incredibly skinny. They always ran a temperature. They ate, but couldn't keep on weight. And they didn't know why. In the 1920s, some researchers, primarily at Stanford, said, one of the compounds that's used in munition manufacturers is 2,4-dinitrophenol, called DNP, 2,4-DNP. And it just so happens that this is the active thing that was actually making these people run temperatures and was producing profound weight loss. And they go, wow, this could be a great weight loss drug. And so, yeah. And so they started writing prescriptions for DNP. They wrote over 100,000 prescriptions in the United States in the 1930s alone, just in the United States. And it was miraculous. At low dose, you could lose a pound a week taking DNP. And at high dose, you could lose 5 pounds a week. Talk about a miracle. Now, there was unfortunately some side effects. The more you took, the more your temperature went up. You started having thyroid issues. You developed cataracts. Now, this is before cataract surgery. And I like to joke, it's great getting into that skinny dress, but if you can't see yourself in that skinny dress, think about that. And then there were deaths. And it turns out that in 1938, the FDA, newly formed, one of their first official acts was to ban DNP for sale. You can still get it on the dark web, but that's another story. What we now know, once Sir Peter Mitchell figured out the electron transport chain, is that DNP was the first oral mitochondrial uncoupler. And the problem was it was really good at mitochondrial uncoupling, but it had no signaling ability to tell mitochondria to make more of themselves. So there you go. You uncoupled so much, you literally couldn't produce enough energy and you died.
Wow.
But so now we go DNP, dinitrophenol. Phenol. Where have I heard that word? Oh yeah, I write a lot about polyphenols. And oh yeah, I have a lot of supplements that are based on polyphenols. So then you go, let's see if polyphenols are uncoupling agents. And lo and behold, they're great uncoupling agents. And you don't have to be in ketosis to get the benefit of the uncoupling of ketones if you're using polyphenols. And I've actually got a tea here with about 6 different teas, and I have several of these a day. And believe it or not, tea is loaded with polyphenols, as is coffee, by the way.
Cheers.
There you go. Now it's got to be black coffee.
Okay.
Turns out that there's very strong research that milk will bind all the polyphenols in coffee or tea. Fun fact, Japanese and Chinese drink tea, as do the British. The Japanese and Chinese get tremendous health benefits from the polyphenols in tea, and the Brits get no benefits because they put milk in it.
Wow. So what are some other examples of, if someone doesn't like their coffee or tea black, polyphenols that you're having people incorporate into their daily diet to support this uncoupling?
So polyphenols are really everywhere. Most people think of them as, dark colors in fruits and vegetables. And as I talk in the book, and it's really fun, nerdy science.
It's a great read.
Okay, so it turns out that plants have their own mitochondria. They're called chloroplasts. And chloroplasts, our mitochondria use oxygen, which is very damaging to mitochondria. People who know about oxygen-free radicals and ROSs and sunlight, they have to produce energy. And so the photons in sunlight are actually very damaging to the plant mitochondria called chloroplasts. So it's kind of can't live with them, can't live without them. And plants have to protect their mitochondria from damage. And they do that with polyphenols that they produce to uncouple their chloroplasts, their mitochondria. Now, we see those mitochondria, those polyphenols every fall in most of the country, where the green chlorophyll in the leaves disappears, and we see all these beautiful yellows, oranges, reds, kind of purples appear on the leaves. Those were the polyphenols that were always there. We just didn't see them because of the bright green and the chlorophyll. What's cool is, so those polyphenols are there protecting the plant's mitochondria by uncoupling them. When we eat polyphenols from plants, when we eat the rainbow, we actually are eating to uncouple for 2 reasons. Number one, polyphenols are not well absorbed from our gut, but our bacteria think they're absolutely delicious. They're prebiotic fiber. The bacteria, in turn, change those polyphenols into absorbable compounds. And these are now called postbiotics. There's probiotics-friendly bacteria. There's prebiotics that feed friendly bacteria. And if you like, the poop of those bacteria are postbiotics. And it just so happens that postbiotics uncouple mitochondria. So every time I think about eating plants to get the benefit from their uncoupling compounds, I think about the Lion King, and you've got young kids, and you'll know Lion King by heart eventually. It's the circle of life, and yeah, we eat the plants, and then we die, and they eat us, and so it's amazing that we look at all these things like in the Mediterranean diet, for instance, and we go, oh, the Mediterranean diet's really good for us and all that. Well, the Mediterranean diet is just chock full of polyphenol compounds, and there's the answer. You look at the Okinawan diet, one of the blue zones, and the Okinawans, the traditional Okinawan, 85% of their diet was a purple sweet potato. And it just so happens that the purple sweet potato is loaded with anthocyanins, a polyphenol. And so they were just uncoupling their mitochondria.
Wow.
Probably the best example of uncoupling in longevity is birds. And I've got a little box about birds. So there's this interesting theory of living, rate of living hypothesis. And it's been around for 100 years. And most people like it because, in general, the smaller the organism, the faster its metabolic rate and the shorter its lifespan. The bigger the organism, the slower its metabolic rate. General, the longer its lifespan. The problem with that theory is birds. Birds are generally small, and they live an incredibly long time. A parrot can live 80 to 100 years. A hummingbird in captivity, which has one of the highest metabolic rates, in existence. A hummingbird's heart beats 1,100 beats a minute. Think about that. Yeah, think about that. And yet a hummingbird in captivity can live 10 years. This little...
Yeah.
Right. And you go, well, how does that happen? Well, it turns out that birds have aggressively uncoupled mitochondria. And hummingbirds, it turns out, uncouple their mitochondria from the nectar in plants. And that red color is actually retinol, a derivative of vitamin A. And retinol is the uncoupler. And here's a really crazy thing, folks. Don't put red food coloring in your hummingbird feeders because it's not going to uncouple their mitochondria. Let them go have, they can have the sugar, but let them go get some plant nectar and uncouple their mitochondria.
Yeah, you're going to help your hummingbirds have longer lifespans. There you go. Well, so outside of polyphenols, I know you talked about the postbiotic effects of polyphenols, meaning like just that circle of life you were talking about. We're eating those colorful plant foods. We're drinking the teas rich in polyphenols. Our bacteria are converting those to postbiotics that are super bioavailable for our body, and we're getting the benefits of eating those plants thanks to our bacteria. Now, what other postbiotics are important in this process? In your book, you talk about short chain fatty acids, specifically butyrate. Can we dive down that rabbit hole real quick?
Sure. So there are a series of compounds called short chain fatty acids, meaning there's not very many fatty acids in a chain. And these are, in general, produced by certain strains of bacteria in our gut. When you give them prebiotic fibers that they like to eat, and they in turn produce butyrate, they produce acetate, acetic acid, they produce propionate. Turns out butyrate is actually the preferred fuel source for colonocytes, the lining of our colon. But butyrate, about 10% of our energy needs can actually be met by butyrate. And butyrate actually is a substrate for beta hydroxybutyrate. And anybody in the keto field went, wait a minute, I've heard of beta hydroxybutyrate. Yeah, that's
BHB. We know that
BHB.
one.
Son of a gun. We can make, BHB from butyrate. So then you go, well, gee, maybe butyrate acts like ketones. And sure enough, butyrate is a great mitochondrial uncoupler. And butyrate is actually a marvelous anti-cancer agent. We won't go into that. But acetate, acetic acid, is vinegar. And one of the fun things is everybody knows how great apple cider vinegar is for you, and it's miraculous, and it causes weight loss, and
balances your blood sugar.
Yeah, it's miraculous.
Drink it before you eat.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, it turns out that acetate uncouples mitochondria. And so, who knew that this fermentation process of fermented foods, it really, quite frankly, wasn't the probiotics in fermented foods that was the benefit. It was actually the postbiotics, these short chain fatty acids, and actually dead bacteria that are signaling compounds to uncouple our mitochondria.
Wow, I already know all the ways that everyone listening needs to improve their diet. We need to be adding vinegars. We need to be adding fermented foods. We need to be adding anything that is a polyphenol, colorful veggie, get all the benefits of our diet, feeding our microbes and giving off all of these postbiotics because they're fabulous.
Yeah, and remember in my previous books, like the Longevity Paradox, we know primarily from animal studies that the more intact our gut barrier is as we age, and everybody remember our gut lining is the same surface area as a tennis court. So when you're watching the French Open in a week or so from now, inside of every one of us is a tennis court. And that lining of our gut is only one cell thick. And there's just such strong data that barrier, as long as it's intact, the longer you live and the longer you live well. As that barrier becomes permeable, as it begins to break down, then bacteria and my favorite subject, lectins, begin to get through, and our immune system goes to pot. We basically fall apart. It's literally like the hordes at the wall, the Great Wall. As the wall breaks down, that's how you break down. So the longer and better we keep that wall intact, the longer and better we live. And compounds like short chain fatty acids are integral in keeping that wall intact. And it turns out that people who have the best uncoupled mitochondria in their wall of their gut have the most intact wall. So, wow, do I want to uncouple my mitochondria with everything I do?
And that's why this book was so exciting for me. It's a new take on an old science and really uncovering what the keys are. Like why is keto been working for people and what's really happening and what else can we do? Because the reality is, like, ketogenic diet, being in practice as a nutritionist for 10 years, working with functional MDs like yourself, sharing patients and getting their Cyrex food allergy tests, getting their NutriVals, looking at everything and trying to help them really prevent a permeable gut, get a better cholesterol ratio. Things that are like strict diets, like a ketogenic diet or any type, whenever we have to put someone on a FODMAPs diet, it's about, can they stick to it? can they be consistent? And if they can't, it can be disheartening. You're not going to see the results you want to see. But this book was a new look on all the different ways that we can uncouple outside of food. I do want to talk about a couple of more food things. You talked about fermented foods, polyphenols. Fiber makes sense to me because fiber is those prebiotics that are creating those postbiotics in our gut. But you talked about polyamines. Can you explain what polyamines are and how they're a signaling mechanism for uncoupling?
Yeah, so polyamines are primarily a product of fermentation. Interestingly enough, one of the most exciting polyamines is called spermidine. I would let your listeners guess where that was identified. And yes, it was found in semen. And
all the husbands are going to listen to this podcast.
Yeah, I know. We won't go down that rabbit hole.
No,
but,
skipping over that.
Yeah, but husbands, pay attention.
Yeah.
You want your wife to live forever. There you go. So these compounds, like spermidine, like putrescine, are present, were first identified, besides in semen, but in fermented cheeses. And aged fermented cheeses are loaded with polyamines. In fact, I was intrigued when I was writing the longevity paradox. There's a study in Italy that men who ate a lot of Parmesan cheese actually had much better vascular health, far fewer coronary issues, far further vascular issues than men who, in other parts of Italy, who didn't eat Parmesan cheese. And so the power of these polyamines to, number one, uncouple mitochondria, but also polyamines are being recognized more and more as a method to tell senescent cells, and that's a whole other subject, to finally commit suicide, to stop being zombie cells and draining energy. And so polyamines may be one of the secrets of cultures that eat a lot of cheeses. And I talk about in the book, there's a food editor of Vogue magazine for many, many years, Jeffrey Steinberg, wrote a book called The Man Who Ate Everything. And one of his chapters was, Why Aren't the French All Dead? And,
wine, cheese,
fatty meats. I was actually just outside of Toulouse, France, just actually last week. Toulouse is famous for all the foie gras, all the cheeses, all the fatty sausages. And Toulouse has the lowest rates of coronary artery disease in all of France. And France, compared to the United States, has really about a third of the coronary artery disease of the United States. And yet, all they do is sit around and, eat cheese and drink wine. Red wine, incidentally, great source of polyphenols. Alcohol in moderation is actually uncouples mitochondria. So don't drink if you're going to get pregnant. We'll talk off.
No, yeah.
That's another subject. So it turns out that they use, and I talk about this in the book, the French love goat and sheep cheeses. And there are several blue zones that secretly, and Dan Butner doesn't know this, but the reason they're blue zones is the huge amount of goat and sheep cheeses and goat and sheep yogurts that these particular cultures eat. And so what's so good about that? Well, the polyamines, but more importantly, goat and sheep milk, 30% of all the fat is MCT oil. In fact, fun fact, MCT oils are named after the Latin word for goat, capra. So there's capric acid, caprylic acid, and so forth. It's because goat has tons of medium chain triglycerides. So you look at these, long-lived goat herders and sheep herders. And you go, well, gee, maybe it's because they're walking up hills and maybe they live in the Mediterranean. No, it's actually because they're actively uncoupling their mitochondria through the food that they're eating. So, I mean, how exciting that.
It's fascinating. It's really exciting. And I have so many moms that listen in on this podcast, and like just thinking about the ways that you can support your kids too and your families, like just serving up the colors. Maybe you are adding some raw goat or sheep cheese to something, and you don't have to, it doesn't have to be black and white. Like dairy is horrible for you, no matter where it comes from. You can really find ways to find the benefits in the foods that you're eating. I am kind of curious because there are some, there are in the health sphere, and that people all on the same podcast and talking about the same things. There are histamines in fermented foods and histamines in fermented dairy, and that is kind of an interesting topic. How do you feel about histamines, especially on the tail end of COVID?
So I've found that most people who are very sensitive to histamines actually are sensitive because they have leaky gut, and that when you solve their leaky gut issue, and one of the things that I do to solve that is to take away lectins. Gluten, by the way, is a lectin, and gluten is a really good way to produce leaky gut, as are other forms of lectins. So with my patient population, their quote histamine intolerance completely goes away. Now, myself is a perfect example. I used to have severe allergies as a young man. I had allergy shots, hay fever, just devastating, blah, blah, blah. I could have a glass of red wine and get a blazing headache and my nose would run. And these were all, histamine reactions.
Right.
I don't have those anymore. I mean, I used to do baby heart transplants with migraine headaches, and I do not recommend that. I haven't had a migraine headache in 25 years since, so.
Wow.
And I have a big practice in migraine headaches. And when we take these compounds away from people and seal their gut, it all goes away. It's like autoimmune disease. And 80% of my practice now is really weird autoimmune diseases that people want to get rid of. And we have a 94% 1-year remission rate of autoimmune diseases. You choose the autoimmune disease if we seal the gut. Hippocrates said 2,500 years ago that all disease begins in the gut. How the heck he knew that without, our impressive battery of tests? But the guy was right. And not only, does all disease begins in the gut, but to paraphrase him, all disease ends in the gut once we fix it. And that's what's so exciting.
Super exciting. And you give so many tools in this new book outside of the gut and what we're feeding our gut, what we're ingesting, because obviously food is the biggest and easiest lever to pull.
Yep.
But outside of food, what can we be doing to signal for mitogenesis and uncoupling?
Well, one of the easiest ways is to time restrict eating or intermittent fasting, or what I call chronoconsumption. And there's beautiful now human data showing that extending the period of ketone production in a 24-hour period to 16 to 18 hours reaps tremendous benefit in uncoupling mitochondria, in weight loss, and improving health. And I hold readers' hands and say, no, you don't have to, tomorrow skip breakfast.
The OMAD.
Yeah, the OMAD. That's what I do, but you don't have to do that. I actually was the first person that I know of to write about intermittent fasting back in 2005. And it's in my first book, Dr. Gundry's Diet Evolution. And my editor, I had a whole chapter on OMAD and intermittent fasting and time restricted eating. And my editor says, this is the craziest idea I've ever heard of. no, this book is crazy enough. I'm not going to let you do this. And I said, no, look, there's really good literature. I've been doing this for 5 years. I've been only eating one meal a day, and it's really good literature. She said, okay, I'll tell you what, I'm going to give you 2 pages to make your case. That's all you get. And we did. And so she came up to me a couple of years ago at the Mind Body Green Symposium, and I hadn't seen her in almost 20 years. And she came up, she said, I need to apologize. You were right. You were so far ahead of this. I should have listened. I should have given you the chapter. I said, that's okay. But yeah, this
You're
is
like,
not.
it's okay. It'll become a different book.
Yeah, it's in all my other books.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but it's really cool. And I talk about this in the book, the Italian athlete study. I think it's something all of us can just kind of grab onto. So they took Italian cyclists and they put them on a training table where they had to eat the exact same food for 3 months. The only difference, they had 2 groups. One group had to eat in a 12-hour window. They had breakfast at 8 o'clock in the morning, lunch at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. They had to finish dinner by 8 o'clock at night. 12-hour eating window, 12-hour fasting window, if you like. The other group, same food. First meal was 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Second meal, lunch, was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Third meal, they had to finish by 8 o'clock at night. So it's a 7-hour eating window. It turns out, even though it's the same food, the athletes who compressed their eating window, lost weight, lowered their insulin-like growth factor 1, which is still our best marker for mTOR activation and longevity, and had identical performance. And so it's in the same food. And you go, wow, that's a powerful technique. Now, there's many reasons for that. Number one, we're extending by about 5 hours the amount of time cells, mitochondria, are exposed to ketones. But we also are allowing the gut wall to rest more than if we're constantly putting little food hour after hour. And so, I mean, that's just a powerful technique. And there it is in action.
I feel like I need to just take that one soundbite and use that as my rebuttal for people who are like, but calories are the only thing that matter.
Oh, I mean, yeah, really, calories in, calories out. The law of thermogenics doesn't apply to the fact that you have the most important organ in your body, the mitochondria, the microbiome, which is perfectly capable of eating a lot of those calories for themselves. I want to give them what they want to eat. And don't get me started. The FODMAP diet is the most disastrous diet for long-term health I have ever seen, because you are absolutely starving the most important organ in your body, which is your microbiome, of everything they need to benefit your health. And yeah, you might have a little less gas and cramping for a while, but that's not the point. You want to embrace the gas production. And I talk people through all this. Gas is good.
So I can probably guess where your thoughts are on the carnivore diet then.
So, I will, some people have accused me of being the father of the carnivore diet, because the carnivore diet removes all plant compounds, and plants in general are not fond of us. There's some that like us and some that don't. And so if you take away all those plant compounds, I think it is useful as a temporary way to help seal the gut. Unfortunately, do I think it is a useful long-term health strategy? No. There's never been a society of a high animal-based diet with longevity. Show me one. Sorry, there isn't one. And you would think if this was a useful long-term strategy, somebody would have developed a diet around that. And it's just, it doesn't exist. Sorry.
We have to coexist with our microbes, and we have to remember it's like it's an ecosystem, and living inside of us. I mean, it's interesting because there are so many, whether it is dealing with SIBO or or using a FODMAPs diet for some form of IBS, or loading your gut with probiotics without understanding the strains, or using antifungals, antibacterials to try and like self-medicate. The gut, I feel like, is like it's like the Great Barrier Reef. You're not just going to throw a bunch of fertilizer or a bunch of antibiotics or, antifungals in somewhere. And it's a very tricky, it seems like, which is why, MDs that I work with like you can be so supportive of clients, but there's a lot of misinformation out there.
I've never had to give an antifungal to any human being. I agree with one of my biggest critics, Michael Greger, that SIBO does not exist. And it's probably the only thing we agree on. But no, yeah, we actually agree on a lot of things. But yeah, he makes a very powerful argument that SIBO and the test for SIBO are absolutely wrong. And one of the things we should realize is that methane, which is one of the ways we detect SIBO, is one of the most important postbiotic gases there is. And yet we go, oh my gosh, you're producing methane gas. That's great news, folks. So yeah, SIBO is, don't get me started on that.
There's your next book. There's your next book. Well, before we wrap up, I want to just touch on hot and cold. And then we'll tell people where they can follow along, where they can snag the book, and get all the good information you're putting out there.
Yeah, so hot and cold therapy, it's become very popular. Saunas, infrared, near infrared therapy, ice plunges with Wim Hof. I got interested in heat therapy back as a heart surgeon when we discovered, I didn't discover it, but we started manipulating it, heat shock protein. And we thought that this had a hormetic effect of protecting heart cells from dying during heart surgery, and indeed it does. And it turns out that these shocks basically tell your mitochondria, oh my gosh, something bad is about to happen. And at all costs, protect yourself because it's about to happen. And how do mitochondria protect themselves? They uncouple. And so now we know that all this cool, sauna therapy and cold therapy has the same common denominator, and that is you're uncoupling your mitochondria. So it's like, oh my gosh, this all works the exact same way. It's not some miracle, mystical thing. It's, that's what it's doing. Okay, let's do that. Sounds good.
So cool. So cool.
Yeah, so come and visit me in Palm Springs in the summer. We'll do some heat shock therapy for you.
Yeah. That's the way to do it. Oh, I'm a lizard. I love it out there. I grew up going out to Palm Springs with my parents. They had a condo out there when I was little, and it was so fun. Spent every spring break out there right before it was 120 degrees.
Yeah, right before. It's funny, the Germans love Palm Springs in the summer, and they just come and bake. It's
good stuff. It's good stuff. Well, Dr. Gundry, this was such a pleasure. Really informative. I'm really excited about your new book. I've been on, reading a number of books for this podcast, and this one really stands out to me this year as such a winner and such great science. So thank you for breaking it down in a digestible way, pun intended, and for all the work you do and helping people, get through autoimmune diseases and heal their gut. So thank you so much. Where can people follow along, and where can they snag the book?
Well, you can get book wherever books are sold. Please visit your local bookstore. They've been decimated with COVID, and they can use our help. But the usual places, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, etc. You can find me at drgundry.com. You can find me at gundrymd.com, my supplement food company. You can find me on the Dr. Gundry podcast, and we've got 2 YouTube channels, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok. If I don't show up on something that you're reading every morning, I've failed. Yep.
You're so hip on TikTok too. Well, we'll link to all of your social channels and we'll make sure people know where to find you. Thank you so much for being here. It was a pleasure.
Thanks very much for having me. Appreciate it.